Hello, everyone, and welcome back to virtual Dirshu Berurah share. We are holding in Berurah Chelek. We will be learning today Daf Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph. We can continue to learn Hilchos Yom Tov. We're holding in Siman Tov Kuf Aleph, and we pick up today in the middle of Sif Gimel. I'm going to read the words of the Mechaber from the beginning of Sif Gimel on Kuf Yud Daled Amud Beis, just so that we could recapture what we were in the middle of learning. Says the Mechaber, Ein mevi'in eitzim min hasadeh. You're not allowed to bring in firewood from the field. Afilu hayu mechunasin sham miba'erev, even if it was collected over there for use from before Yom Tov, it's still aser. And we brought down in the Mishnah Berurah that there are various reasons why this could be aser, either because it's considered an uvda d'chayil. This is a weekday activity, going out and collecting firewood. Also, it's possible that this is too similar to the malacha of ma'amer, gathering something mimakim gidulai from the place where it grows, and therefore the Chazal aser this on Yom Tov. Aval, the Mechaber continues, Megabav hu basadeh mishalafanav. What somebody is allowed to do is, let's say he has a tanur, he has some kind of oven outside in the sadeh. He's allowed to collect firewood from what's next to the tanur, pick it up and throw it into the tanur. That he's allowed to do because it's very clear that what he's doing is l'tzarech Yom Tov. And then the Ramah said, V'chein b'chatzer lekech melafanav. And so too in a chatzer, the Ramah said you're also only allowed to take from what's next to the tanur, what's next to the makam of bishul. Even in a chatzer, you're not allowed to go ahead and collect wood from around the chatzer. Umadlik sham, you're allowed to burn it over there. Now continues the Mechaber on the top of Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph. You're allowed to bring in firewood that was already collected and gathered into a Rishus HaYachid. Even if this is a Rishus HaYachid, it's a fenced-in area that was not fenced in for dira purposes. If you remember back when we were learning the halachas of Eruv, Chatzeros, and Hoitzah, we spoke about a karpev shaloi hukaf ledira. Sometimes you have an area that's fenced in, but it was not fenced in for residential purposes. So even if you have such an area, it's a Rishus HaYachid, but you have wood collected over there, you're allowed to bring it in. However, it has to be able to be closed up. It has to be a fence that can be closed up, and therefore that makes the wood that's collected inside it protected. It's in a makom mishumer, and therefore it's considered muchan for use. And of course, it has to be within the tchum. But if it's missing any one of these prerequisites, then that wood would be considered muktzah, and you would not be allowed to collect it and use it on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting your daled miskeres. And this Rishus HaYachid has to have a fence, it has to have a gate. If it doesn't have a gate, then even though the wood may have been collected in there from Erev Yom Tov, havale kisadeh. That's not considered a Rishus HaYachid. It's considered a sadeh. It's considered an open field, where we said earlier you're not allowed to bring in from a sadeh. Even if the wood was collected in the sadeh from Erev Yom Tov, still you're not allowed to bring in from a sadeh. It's only considered a Rishus HaYachid if it's a Rishus HaYachid and it has a gate that could be closed up. The Ois Katan Tezvav, the Mishnah Berurah says, V'tiyah b'soich tchum Shabbos. This Rishus HaYachid has to be within the tchum Shabbos, to the city, to the area where you want to do your cooking. Umashma, the implication is that afilu b'samach la'ir nami tzarich miskeres. The implication of this is that even if you had this fenced-in area right outside the city within the tchum, still it has to have a gate. Many poskim disagree with this. According to them, any type of Rishus HaYachid that's close to the city limits, and that means if it's with 70 and a third amas to the city, it would not need to have a gate. When do you need a gate? From 70 and a third and outwards, to the border of 2,000 amas, halacha, and that's the halacha. The Mechaber said if you're missing any one of these prerequisites, if the wood that we're dealing with was not gathered, Oisha chasar miskeres, or the area that it's in is not gated, Oichutz l'tchum, or this area is outside of the Tchum Shabbos, then Ois Katan Yud Zayin Arei in Muktzah, then the wood is considered Muktzah and you can't use it on Yom Tov. Lefia ta'amim shekasavnu la'el dehev k'uvda d'chayil. This is in accordance with the reasons that we said in yesterday's shir. Either gathering this wood would constitute an uvda d'chayil, a weekday activity, Oy mishum chashash imur, or because it looks like you're doing ma'amer. Din zehu l'kulei alma. Therefore, because of these reasons, this halacha is true even according to those shitas in Siman Tov Tzadikei that are mekel and muktzah on Yom Tov. Over here, the Chazal consider this wood muktzah according to all opinions. The yesh mefarshim halacha zu kipshutai. There are those that learn this mechaber in a much simpler fashion, which is the imchaser echad mitanoim halalu. If you're missing any one of these prerequisites, mistama asaktaite minayum ashtumushe b'yamtiv, then it becomes muktzah, because if you're missing any one of these ingredients, if the area that the wood is in is not gated, so then the person is mesiach das. He doesn't have his das. His mindset is not that he has that wood available for Yom Tov use, because he knows he doesn't have it in a protected area. Or if it's not within the tchum, he's mesiach das from that wood, because he's not schlepping wood from outside of the tchum to bring it in for burning on Yom Tov. V'havila muktzah, and therefore it's muktzah. It's not prepared for Yom Tov use. According to this opinion, then lamad deshari muktzah b'Yom Tov. Then according to the more lenient opinions in Siman Tov Tzadikei that are mekel and muktzah on Yom Tov, mutar gam bazeh, then this would not be considered muktzah. Uladina nachel lahachmir. However, halacha lamaisa, it would be proper to rule stringently. Okay, Siv Dalet. Ale kanim va'ale gefanim. The leaves that grow on reeds or the leaves of grapevines, which are also usable for fuel, even if they are gathered up in a pile, in a karpef. If you remember, a karpef is a fenced-in area. In the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, generally speaking, we called the yard in front of the house the chotzer. The chotzer was made for all sorts of residential usages. They would store things in the chotzer. They would cook in the chotzer. They would do their laundry in the chotzer. So the chotzer was a residential area. It was used for the residential usages of those living in the homes. Then behind the house, they had a fenced-in yard that was called a karpef. The karpef was used more for storage. So they kept their firewood out in the karpef, and they used the karpef in that manner. So if you have these kind of leaves, even if they're gathered up and they're piled up in the karpef, since these are very lightweight, and the nature of these items is that the wind will scatter them, therefore, even if they're piled up, it is considered halachically, we look at them as if they're scattered all over the yard, va'asurin, and you're not allowed to gather them up and use them on Yom Tov. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah and see why this is the case. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut in Yud Ches. Kevan shaharach mifazeres. Since the wind generally scatters these leaves, I want you to imagine, those of you who have yards and have trees, imagine during the fall you're going outside to rake your leaves. So we all know if you rake your leaves into a pile, you better take the pile and bag it up and put it out by the curb quickly, because otherwise what will happen is you'll put in all of that effort to do the raking, and then the wind comes and it blows your pile all over the yard again. Or it'll rain on your pile and your pile gets wet and moldy and stinky. But we know that the wind scatters the leaves very easily. So says the Mishnah Berurah here, nice cut in Yud Ches. What the Mechaber wants to say over here is, what's the problem with these leaves and what's the problem with the fact that the wind blows them? Since it's the way of the wind, that the wind will scatter these leaves, it's very nice that the homeowner knows that he raked up these ali kanim and these ali gefanim into piles, but that does not render them muchan for use as fuel on Yom Tov, because he knows that it's very likely a wind will come and scatter them all over the yard again. So therefore, halachically, we consider them to be mufuzar, to be scattered around the karpef, even if they happen to be mechunas, even if they happen to be stacked up into a pile and prepared, we still do not look at them as being muchan. And therefore, continues the Mishnah Berurah, va'afilo matzah oisan michunasin, even if you happen to walk out into the karpef and find that the pile of the alikonim or the aligafanim is intact, you're still not allowed to use those alikonim and those aligafanim. Aser mishum muktzah. They're still aser because they're considered muktzah. Now continues the Mechaber. So far the Mechaber said the alikanim and the aligafanim, even if you piled them up in the karpef, they're still not available for Yom Tov use because they're considered muktzah. Why are they considered muktzah? Because even though you piled them up, you know that the wind will scatter them. Now, says the Mechaber, V'im hiniach alehem kli kaved me'erev Yom Tov. However, if you made a pile of alikonim and aligafanim, and then you put something heavy on top of them to weigh them down so that the wind should not scatter them, then harei elu muchanim. Then they're considered muchan, then they are considered prepared for Yom Tov use. Because now you don't expect them to blow around. Now you know you piled them up, you know you weighed them down with something, so now they're muchan, and they're ready, and they're prepared for Yom Tov use, and you're allowed to use them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut in Yud Tes. Kli kaved me erev Yom Tov. If you put a heavy keli on top of them from erev Yom Tov, shalo yefazreim haruach, so that the wind should not scatter them, then ois katan chaf harei elu muchanim. Then they're considered muchan for Yom Tov use, and therefore says the Chavetz Chaim, va'afilu mitzon b'Yom Tov mifuzarin. Now the opposite halacha is true. If you made a pile of leaves and you weighed them down with a beach chair, and now you come out on Yom Tov and you find the leaves somehow scattered around the yard, you're still allowed to use them because they're not muktzah. They're not muktzah because they were properly made muchan for Yom Tov. You stacked them up and you put a chair on top of them. So you had your mind on them for Yom Tov use. Now, yes, it's true it got scattered around the yard, but they're still considered muchan. Now, the Chavetz Chaim is going to point out that what we just said is only true according to those shittas who hold that the problem over here is a muktzah problem. If you hold that the problem of gathering up the leaves in the karpef is a muktzah problem because the leaves weren't considered muchan because the nature of the wind is to blow them around the yard. So now, by weighing them down with a beach chair, you made them muchan, and now, even if you find them scattered, you're allowed to use them. But how about according to the shittas that hold that muktzah is not the problem? According to the shittas that hold that the problem is the problem of ma'amer, that it's like the malacha of ma'amer to gather them up if they're mafuzar, then this would not be true. So let's continue the Mishnah Berurah here. So the Mishnah Berurah again, Eis Kat and Chaf, if you weighed the leaves down, then they're considered muchan, and therefore, even if you found them on Yom Tov that they had been scattered, still mutarin, they're still mutar. Why? Because they were properly made muchan from before Yom Tov when you weighed them down with a chair. Now, all of this I'm writing, according to the shittas who understand the halacha that we're discussing here based on the halacha of muktzah. But according to the shita who holds that the problem of gathering up scattered leaves is not a muktzah problem, it's a ma'amer problem, time of Duration. So then the reason of the first halacha that the Mechaber said, which is that you're not allowed to use the alikonim and the aligafanim if you piled them up because it's the nature of the wind to blow them. What's the reason for that? The reason is maybe you went ahead and you stacked up your aligafanim and your alikonim in the yard for use on Yom Tov. Now you're going to come out on Yom Tov to get them. You might find that the wind blew them all over the yard. You're going to go ahead and you're going to collect them. Oh, collecting them is the malacha of ma'amer. Yefazrem aruach. Maybe when you come out to collect them, you'll find that the wind scattered them. V'yavai lalaktem biyachad. So you're going to go gather them up. Oh, that's a problem. That's ma'amer. Ma'amer is not mutter. But ukeshamunach aleim kli kaved. But if from before Yom Tov you went and you put a beach chair down on the piles of leaves, then we don't have to worry that when you come out, you're going to find them scattered. because you went ahead and you put a beach chair on top of them. Vishari, therefore it's mutter. So again, we have two different ways of approaching this halacha of the mechaber. We have two halachas in the mechaber. Halacha number one, you stacked up alikanim and aligafanim in the backyard, in the karpef. You're not allowed to use them on Yom Tov. Why? So we have two reasons. According to those shitas who understand the potential problem over here as a muktzah problem, those leaves are muktzah. Why are they muktzah? Because even though you made them into a pile from before Yom Tov, they're still not considered muchan, because the nature of the leaves is that the wind will blow them. And since the wind is going to blow them up, blow them around, the fact that you put them in a pile does not make them muchan. They're not considered muchan. You can't say that you had your das on those leaves, because you know that the leaves are going to get scattered around the yard. That's halacha number one, according to the opinion that the driving halacha over here is muktzah. Now, halacha number two is that if you made the piles and you weighed them down with the beach chair, then you are allowed to use them. Why? Because by putting a beach chair on them, now you did make them muchan, because now there's no expectation that they're going to blow around the yard. What if they did blow around the yard? They're still mutter. Why are they mutter? Because they're still muchan. Your das was on them. There was no expectation that they were going to blow around the yard. By putting the beach chair on the pile, you made them muchan, even if they happened to blow around. Now we have the other way of looking at it, that the driving halacha over here is not the halacha of muktzah. The driving halacha is the halacha of ma'amer. So again, let's analyze the two halachas. The first halacha is you made piles in the yard and you didn't weigh them down. You can't use them on Yom Tov. Why can't you use them? Because we're afraid that when you go out to the yard to use them, you're going to find that the wind scattered them. And when you find that the wind scattered them, you're going to go collect them. Oh, you're going to go collect them? Now you're collecting leaves, mimakam gidulai. You're collecting leaves from the area that they grew in. That constitutes ma'amer. You're not allowed to do ma'amer. So we can't let you use them even if they're in a pile. Because of a chash, maybe you'll come out, you'll find them scattered, and you'll do ma'amer. Now, what if you weighed them down with a beach chair? If you weigh them down with a beach chair, then we don't have to worry that you're going to find them scattered. Why should you find them scattered? You weighed them down with a beach chair. But according to this shita, if you do find them scattered, you're not allowed to use them, because that would be ma'amer. So you're not allowed to use them. Okay. Now we go to Sifhei. Now we're going to discuss a different type of fuel. And those of us here in the New York area where we just had the tropical storm can identify with the topic over here in Sifhei very well. Eitzim shenoshru min ilan b'Yom Tov. Let's say you have wood that blew off the trees on Yom Tov. I know I have a very big tree out in my backyard, and it drops branches all the time. It drops these small branches. Any windy day, it's dropping small branches. And whenever I want to mow the lawn in the backyard, the first step of the process is you have to go around the yard and rake up all of the twigs. Otherwise, they get caught in the blades of the mower. So, eitzim shenoshru min ilan b'Yom Tov. Let's say you have branches that fell off of a tree on Yom Tov. So before Yom Tov, they were mechuber. Before Yom Tov, they were part of the tree. On Yom Tov, they fell off the tree. Ein masikin b'hem. You're not allowed to burn them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, is cotton chaf aleph. Ein masikin b'hem. You're not allowed to use them for fuel on Yom Tov. Very simple. Why? The hahaya mechuber being esmail. Because yesterday on Erev Yom Tov, they were mechuber to the tree. They were part of the tree. V'havalei muktzah. So if they're part of the tree, you're not allowed to go out to a tree and break off a branch on Yom Tov. So since on Erev Yom Tov they were mechuber to the tree, so ben hashmashus they were muktzah. Ben hashmashus, it was part of the tree, so it's muktzah for the whole Yom Tov. So you're not allowed to use it. Now the Chavetz Chaim puts in over here, and if you look at the Sharetzion Ezkat and Chavav, he brings this from the Paiskim. He doesn't say from who, but he brings another reason why these branches are usher. Va'oid shema yalev yitlosh. There's another reason why we're not going to allow you to use these twigs. Because if we allow you to use these twigs for Yom Tov, we're afraid you're going to go out to the yard, you're going to start picking up these twigs, and then you're going to say, oh, I need some more twigs. Oh, look, there's a branch that looks a little bit dry. I'll break it off the tree, and I'll use that. Oh, Shema Yalav Yitlash. You might go and you might break branches off of the mechuber on Yom Tov, and you're not allowed to do that. And that's another reason why this is usher. Now, the Sharetzion in Eis Katan Chavav says that the reason he put in a second reason over here is because the first reason that it was mechuber to the tree, that is based on muktzah. And in Tat Tzadikei, we had those shitas that are mekel and muktzah. So maybe over here also we could be mekel and muktzah. So you should know there's another reason. There's Gzeira Shemiyala v'Yitleish. But this is all very complex. Both of these reasons you can quibble on both of these reasons. I'm not going to get into it because it's complex, but suffice it to say that there are two reasons here, and there are kashas and terutzim on both of the reasons. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, va'afilu b'tiltul asurin, these twigs that fell off the tree at Yom Tov, not only you're not allowed to use them for hasaka, not only you're not allowed to use them for fuel, but they're also muktzah. They're also b'tiltul. Now we go to Sivav. Kalim shenishberu b'Yom Tov. Let's say you have kalim, you have utensils of some kind that broke on Yom Tov. So you have a nice wooden chair, and your wooden chair collapsed on Yom Tov. So it was a chair, and now it's stam eitzim. It was a chair, and now it's just wood. I'm not talking about a chair that you're going to save and you're going to fix. I'm talking about some cheap wooden chair. It thoroughly collapsed on Yom Tov, and now it's scraps of wood. Okay, scraps of wood, usually, especially in those days, you could use them for firewood. So the Mechaber says, Kalim shenishberu b'Yom Tov. If you have kalim that broke on Yom Tov, and now you're tempted to use the wood for firewood, says the Mechaber, ein masikin mehem. You're not allowed to burn this as firewood. Why? Mipnei shehem noilad. Because they are considered to be noilad. This is something that completely changed its status on Yom Tov. Think about it. Ben Hashmashis, when Yom Tov began, this was a chair. Now it's no longer a chair. Now it's firewood. So you're looking at this pile of firewood that you want to use to cook with on Yom Tov, but this is firewood that became firewood on Yom Tov. It wasn't firewood when Yom Tov started, so it wasn't muchan for use as firewood. It was muchan for use as a chair, but it wasn't muchan for use as firewood. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. It's Katan Chav Beis. Shenishberu. First thing that the Mishnah Berurah is going to analyze here, what does it mean that the keli broke? To what extent are we talking about? To what extent did the keli break? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu shenishberu, we're talking about a case where the keli broke to the extent, Hainu shenishberu kol kach, it broke to the extent, she'ein re'uyin l'ke'ein malachtan harishayna, that it is no longer usable for a use that's even similar to its original use. And he explains what he means. First he says, Aval imru'uyin l'ke'ein malachtan harishayna. However, let's say we're talking about a keli that broke, but even though it's broken, it's still somewhat usable for a similar usage to its original intended usage. Dahainu, for example, shivrei areva. Let's say you have a kneading trough. You have a big kneading bowl, and the kneading bowl broke. Okay, what does it mean it broke? It got a hole. Okay, so you're not going to be able to use it anymore for its original purpose, but it's still shivrei areva, not a kneading bowl. I should have typed it as a kneading bowl. We usually call an areva a kneading bowl, but a kneading bowl wouldn't break from its original usage from just a small hole because dough is very thick unless the liquid is going to leak out when you pour the liquid into the flour. So maybe it is a kneading bowl. But the point is it's some kind of bowl. Tahainu shivrei areva. It's some kind of bowl that broke. It has a hole or a crack, but it's still usable. Lotzuk l'saichan, to pour into it mikvah, a mikvah, which he translates here as a meichel of, a very thick type of dish. So it's true. The bowl that you had is no longer fit for its original use. Let's say it was a soup tureen. A soup tureen that has a crack or has a little hole, you can't use it as a soup tureen anymore. So you're going to say to yourself, okay, I have a keli, and it's a keli that broke. So it was a keli, and now it's firewood. I had a wooden soup tureen. It got a hole in it. So I'll say to myself, oh, this is a keli that broke on Yom Tov. It was a keli, and now it's firewood. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. That soup tureen that got a hole in it, it's not yet considered shivrei kalim. It's not considered firewood yet. You know why? Because you could still use it to put a mikvah in it. You're right, you can't put soup in it, but you could use it to put bagels out on the table. So it's usable for a usage that is a me'ain of its original usage. Therefore, it's not a shever keli. It's not yet considered a broken keli. Or v'shivrei zechuchis, let's say you have broken pieces of glass from a glass bowl. Lotzuk l'soichan shemen. And they're still usable. You have a curved piece of glass, and you could still put a half a teaspoon of oil in it, and you could use it to dish out a little bit of oil. So it's true that it's a broken piece of glass, but it's not considered a shever keli. It still has the status of a keli because it's still usable for a usage that is similar to its original intended usage. Now, why does that matter? The reason it matters, says the Mishnah Berurah, is in that case they are kikelim shleimim hein. Those are considered to still be complete kelim umasikin bahen, and you are allowed to use them as fuel. So let's just recapture what we said over here. The Mechaber said that if you have kelim that broke on Yom Tov, you cannot use them for fuel in a fire. Why? Because it's a problem of noilad. Why is it noilad? Because if you had a wooden soup tureen and now it broke to the extent that it's firewood, when did it become firewood? It became firewood on Yom Tov. So that's noilad. Before Yom Tov, it was not firewood. It only became firewood on Yom Tov. So are you going to say that it was muchan for use as firewood before Yom Tov? No, it wasn't firewood before Yom Tov. Therefore, you're not allowed to take it and you're not allowed to burn it. But let's back up for a second. Let's say you had a wooden tureen, you had a wooden soup bowl on Yom Tov, and it didn't break at all. And you decided you want to take the wooden soup bowl and you want to chuck it into the fire to use it for firewood. Are you allowed to do that? Yes, you are allowed to do that. Now, the Chavetz Chaim is going to say later, you're only allowed to do it if you don't have anything else to burn. Because if you do have other firewood to burn, why are you allowed to burn a soup tureen? That's the issur of Bal Tashkis. You're wasting a perfectly good keli by burning it. You're not allowed to burn a perfectly good keli if you have firewood to burn. But that's a Zaitika issue. Well, let's get this straight. A soup tureen, which is a keli, is muchan for use. Now, it's not only muchan for use as a soup tureen. The halacha is that since a keli is muchan for use on Yom Tov, it's muchan for any use that you want to do with it. It's muchan for its intended use. It's also muchan for an unintended use. So you want to burn your soup tureen, you're allowed to burn your soup tureen. But if your soup tureen breaks and it becomes firewood, then you can't burn it. I know it sounds a little counterintuitive. If it breaks and it becomes firewood, now you're not allowed to burn it because that firewood was not muchan from before Yom Tov. Because before Yom Tov, it wasn't firewood. Now the Chavetz Chaim is pointing out that there's an interesting in-between case over here. Let's say your wooden soup tureen broke, but it didn't break to the degree that it became firewood. It broke so that you can no longer use it as a wooden soup tureen, but you still can use it to put bagels out on the table. Then it's still a viable keli. If it's still a viable keli, then you are allowed to burn it because it's not a noilad problem. Let's continue in the words of the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says over here, if it still is somewhat usable for its original purpose, like the broken soup tureen, so you could put in a thick Michael, or you could use it for the bagels, or v'shivrei zchuchis, if you have broken pieces of glass, shemen, so you can't use it as a bowl anymore, but you could still use the broken pieces to put a little oil in, then kikelim shleimim hein, then they're still considered to be complete kelim, umasikin bahen, and then you can burn them on Yom Tov. V'ayin le'el b'simin shin ches sevav b'taz u'bi'ar halacha sham. The problem with burning the pieces of the broken kelim is shehem noilad. It's a noilad problem. What's the noilad problem? The meikara keli, because before it broke, it was a keli. V'hashta shever kli, and now it's a broken keli. Now it's firewood. V'asurim betiltel. Now you're not even allowed to be metaltalit. Now it's mamish muktzah. You're not allowed to move these broken pieces of a keli. Ulakach asur lahafik b'hem, and therefore you can burn them. And now the Chavetz Chaim points out an interesting thing. You'll say to yourself, how about if I don't have to move them? How about if the wooden soup tureen broke and punked where the broken pieces of wood fell? I want to make a fire right over there. so I don't have to be metaltal them. Am I allowed to just put a match to it and go ahead and light it up and make a fire? Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. Va'afilu ein metaltal on klal, even if you don't have to be metaltal them at all. Ela sarfan b'mekaiman, rather you're going to burn them right where they are. Shemunachim sham, right where they're laying. Gam kain aser, even that is aser. Why? The ma'isa hadlaka, because the act of lighting them, sha'oisa bakli, the act that you do of lighting the keli, shenidlekes al yadai, that's becoming lit through your action, chashiv ketiltal. That's considered tiltal. The keli is sitting over there alone, unbothered. You put a match to it and you light it up. That constitutes tiltal of muktzah, and you're not allowed to do that. Okay. Now, we read the Mechaber from the beginning of Sivav in Tol the Ramah, in Tol the Eis Katan Chav Dalid for the Mishnah Berurah. Now, just take a look right away before we read the words of the Ramah. Take a look at Eis Katan Chav Dalid, and you'll see why we're going to skip the words of the Ramah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hagazu, this comment of the Ramah is out of place. It is properly supposed to be placed at the completion of the next sentence of the words of the Mechaber. So this gloss of the Ramah is out of place, and therefore we are skipping it, and we're going to the bottom line of Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph in the Mechaber with the word Avol. So far the Mechaber said over here, if you have kalim that broke on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to use them for fuel on Yom Tov, because that would constitute the muktzah of noilot. Continues the Mechaber, Avol, however, masikin bekalim shleimim, you are allowed to burn intact kalim. Like I said, you want to take your wooden soup tureen and chuck it in the fire, you're allowed to do that. Or if you have broken pieces of a keli that broke before Yom Tov, so it was already firewood before Yom Tov. There's no noilid issue. You're allowed to burn those on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Chav Ches. Again, we're skipping the Mishnah Berurahs that apply to the gloss of the Ramah that we skipped. So we're skipping right now Ois Katan Chav Hei, Chavav, and Chav Zayin. And now we're going to Ois Katan Chav Ches. Bekalim shleimim. The Mechaber said you're allowed to burn complete intact kalim. Daf dekli eino oimed lahasaka. Right? You'll turn around and you say, wait a second. Why am I allowed to burn a wooden soup tureen on Yom Tov? It's not muchan for burning. Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be muchad for burning. Nevertheless, haloi kaimalon we paskin the kala kalim nitalin, that all kalim are allowed to be moved on Yom Tov. Afilu shaloi l'tzarich tashmisha namiyuchad lehen, even if you're moving them not for the purpose that they were intended for. So you're not only allowed to move a soup tureen on Shabbos and Yom Tov if you want to use it as a soup tureen. If you want to take the soup tureen, take it out to the backyard and use it as a frisbee, you're allowed to do that also. Because it's a keli that's allowed to be moved on Yom Tov, you can move it for whatever use you want. So you want to burn it, burn it. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, however, we have to be speaking about a case where you have no other fuel for your fire to cook with. Because if you do have other fuel, of our baltashkas, then you're being over on the Yisr of baltashkas. You're not allowed to burn up a keli. Why are you burning up a keli if you could burn something else? Now the Chavetz Chaim comments, and he says, "V'lipa'amim, you should know that there are times that also lahasik af b'kelim shleimim. There are times that you're not allowed to burn even a complete intact keli. Kigoin, for example, akum shalokach eitzim shel Yisrael. Let's say a non-Jew came and he took wood that belonged to a Yisrael, va'asa mehen keli b'Yom Tov, and he built it into a keli. Ta'avalei noilad. Guess what? Now that keli is muktzah because of noilad. The meikara eitzim, because before the non-Jew took it and built it into a keli, it was wood. Vahash the keli. Now it's a keli. Well, then it's muktzah because of noilad. Now the Chavetz Chaim says, eitz shemechatin by ha'esh. If you have a poker that you use to stoke the fire. Kevan shehu meyuchad lekach. Since it's a piece of wood that is set aside for this usage, harehu keli, it is a keli. Ve'im nishbar b'Yom Tov, and if it goes out and breaks on Yom Tov, asur lahasikai. There's always that temptation. You have a wooden poker, you're working the fire, it breaks, you figure I'll chuck it into the fire. No, you're not allowed to chuck it into a fire. It was a keli, and now it's shivrei kelim. It's shivrei kelim, that's noilud, you're not allowed to chuck it into the fire. Ais kat nechav tes, the Mechaber said if you have a keli that broke before Yom Tov, you're allowed to burn it on Yom Tov. Shenishbaru min ba'od yom, no problem. But again, the Chavetz Chaim points out that depends to what extent it broke before Yom Tov. If the broken keli is still usable for a similar usage as its original usage, dinon kishleimin, then it's considered an intact keli. Now, why does that matter? Let's remember, what's the case that we're talking about? We said if a keli broke before Yom Tov, then it was a keli before Yom Tov. It broke. It became firewood before Yom Tov. You want to burn it on Yom Tov? Go ahead. It's firewood. It's not noilud. It became firewood before Yom Tov. Now he's telling you, well, wait a second. It depends to what extent it broke. Let's say it was the wooden soup tureen that broke, but it's still usable to put bagels in. Okay, so it's still a keli. All right, so it's still a keli. So what? We said you're allowed to burn intact kelim on Yom Tov. So why does it make a halachic difference? So says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you why. Because, and the root of this halacha is going to be in the Mishnah Berurah that we skipped and the Ramah that we skipped that we're about to go back to. You see, there's a different problem. Let's say you're burning a complete intact keli on Yom Tov. So you have a wooden soup tureen. You don't have any other fuel for your fire. So you decide, all right, what am I going to do? I got to cook for Yom Tov. I'm going to burn my nice wooden soup tureen. So you take your beautiful wooden intact soup tureen. You're allowed to burn it, right? It's a keli. It's not muktzah. You're allowed to handle it for whatever you want. You take it, you chuck it into the fire. What happens when it starts burning? When it starts burning, it becomes a shever keli. When it starts burning, now it's noilud. Now it's muktzah. Therefore, since it's muktzah, now you can't take a poker and stoke it because you're not allowed to be metaltal it. So too over here. If you have a keli that broke before Yom Tov, you have a wooden soup tureen that broke before Yom Tov, but it's still usable to put bagels in, you're allowed to burn it on Yom Tov. It's true you're allowed to burn it. But the reason you're allowed to burn it is because you're allowed to burn complete intact kelim. But now once it catches fire, you're not allowed to poke it because you're not allowed to be metaltal it because it became firewood on Yom Tov. Now let's go back to the Ramah. So we said that this Ramah on Kuf Tez Vav Amud Aleph was supposed to be after the words of the Mechaber, Aval Masikin B'Kelim Shleim. So the Mechaber told me the halacha that you want to take your beautiful intact wooden soup tureen and you want to chuck it into the fire to cook your eggs on Yom Tov. You're allowed to do that. Now, comments the Ramah. Let's go back to the Haggah by the Eis Kat Chav Daled for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Ramah, Ve'im hisik b'kelim, if you are burning intact kelim on Yom Tov, asur la'afayich ba'eish, you're not allowed to poke the fire la'achar shehudlaku b'miktzas, after the intact kelim catch fire somewhat, does have a shivrei keli. Because once the intact keli catches fire, now it's no longer an intact keli. Now it's a shever keli. If it's a shever keli, it's muktzah because of noilad. Ella imkain riba aleim eitzim muchan. Unless you're mevatel the keli by putting on regular firewood, then it's considered bottle in the regular firewood, and then you're allowed to poke the fire. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Kat and Chav, hey. La'achar shehudlaku b'miktzas, once the keli catches fire a little, you're no longer allowed to stoke the fire. It's Tzayner Loimar. What the Mechaber wants to say is, shehudlaku kol kach, where it caught fire to the extent, she'ein ru'uyin l'che'ein malachtan harishayna, where it's no longer usable for a usage similar to its original usage. That's when it becomes a shever keli. So you take your wooden intact soup tureen, you throw it into the fire to burn it. It doesn't become a shever keli immediately. It becomes a shever keli when it burns to the extent that it's not usable for anything even similar to its original usage. Then it becomes a shever keli. Now you're not allowed to stoke the fire. Ice cotton chav vav shivrei keli. It becomes a shever keli. Ubeloi hiperich ba'esh. If you don't stoke the fire, af shenene min hamuktzah, even though you're deriving benefit from something that's muktzah, shenis bashel sham tavshilai, because your eggs are getting cooked through this thing that's muktzah, leflan ba. That's not an issue. The muktzah mutter bahana. Muktzah is not osir bahana. Heichi shahana ba'a me'eleha ve'ena oisa ma'isa biyadayim. Since the hana is something that's happening memela, that you're not doing anything to make that hana. We will explain this halach in greater detail later on in Siman Tov Kuf Zayin. Ois Katan Chav Zayin in the Mishnah Berurah. This is true that you're not allowed to stoke the fire unless you're mavatal the broken keli by adding on normal firewood, which is muchan. Then you're mavatal the shivrei kelim. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chav Zayin Eitzim Muchanim V'Yisbar LeKaman B'Siman Tov Kuf Zayin Siv Beis. We will explain this in greater detail in Tov Kuf Zayin Siv Beis. That completes the Mishnah Berurah that we had skipped. So now we are up to Siv Zayin. That will conclude today's share. Yes, Hashem, tomorrow we will pick up with Siv Zayin on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should stand Gans Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas, Refuas, and Parnasa to all those in need, and we should be Zaycha to see the Bias Gal Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Be well.